Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Or first of all, I guess live with Kevin, eventually a podcast episode. So glad that you are here. While you're here, I hope that you will engage with my guest and I, and that starts by typing in the comments section on whatever platform you're on with a hello and where you're from. Just tell us where you're from. It'll get you used to using your fingers because over the next 30 minutes or so, I hope that you will use them because, if you were sitting at a table with my guest and I, and the three of us were having a conversation, you wouldn't just sit there. You wouldn't multitask, I would hope, like I'm hoping you won't do for the next few minutes. What you would do is if you had a question, you'd ask it. If you had a comment, you would share it. If you had an idea, you would offer it, right? That's what you do. Naturally, we would be having a conversation. And I'd like for you to make this a conversation too. Yes, I've got some things I'm going to ask my guest. And yes, at the end of the day, I may not be able to get to all of your questions, but if you will share yours, it will be a better conversation. And you may get your specific question answered too, which is pretty awesome, right? So that's sort of my hope for our time together while we're live. And if you're listening to this or watching this later, you can still put your comments in there. If you have something specific you want to ask me or my guest, you can certainly point those questions to the two of us. But now I'm going to start what will be eventually the podcast. If you listen to this podcast, you won't see or hear any of the stuff I just said. So this is for you, Marissa. We will cut after 3, 2, 1. Leadership is hard, and so is being a leader. To succeed and thrive, to become our best, our guest today says, to become unconquerable, you need to master not just the skills and techniques of leadership, but yourself. And that's where we're going to focus today, on the inner game, of leadership. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast, where we are helping leaders grow personally and professionally to lead more effectively and make a bigger positive difference for their teams, organizations, and the world. If you are listening to this podcast, you could join us in the future for live episodes because nearly all of these episodes are first streamed live. You can find out when they're happening and get other updates and things that are going on with the podcast by joining our Facebook or LinkedIn groups. Just go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to join and get in on the fun and frivolity. I hope you'll do that. Now, today's episode is brought to you by our Remarkable Master Classes. Pick from 13 important life and leadership skills to help you become a more effective, productive, and confident leader while overcoming some of the toughest challenges you face. Learn more and sign up at remarkablemasterclass.com. And now that's my cue to bring in our guest. And so I'm going to add him. If you're watching, there he is. Let me introduce our guest today. His name is Nathan Tanner. Nathan is an executive coach who helps CEOs, founders, and high-impact leaders scale themselves and their companies. He has been an HR leader at Neighbor, DoorDash, LinkedIn, and Lehman Brothers. He has coached leaders at high-growth startups and bellwether companies like DoorDash, Google, Autodesk, Electronic Arts, LinkedIn, Procter & Gamble, and Lyft. He's the author of 2 books, Not Your Parents' Workplace, and his new book, The Unconquerable Leader. Nathan has been an advisor at Y Combinator and writes for Forbes, Inc., Fast Company, and nathantanner.net. He's an Ironman triathlete. If you read his book, you'll learn more about that. He holds an MBA from BYU and was trained as a coach at Coactive Training Institute. Nathan lives with his wife and their 4 children in southern Utah. Today, he's our guest. And Nathan, thanks for being here. So glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Appreciate it. Good to be here.
So, I'm going to say something. Usually I start with a question. Today, I'm going to start with a comment. In reading this book, I'm going to tell all of you that, I don't have guests here where I haven't read the book or vetted these guests in a way that I'm already sort of recommending them by them simply being here. But I want to tell you, Nathan, and I want to tell everyone else that when I read this book, The Unconquerable Leader, here's one of the things that I noted. I noted that if we as leaders want a good example in writing of being vulnerable, Nathan's a great example. he's a role model for me. The stories that he tells in the book, many of them are not pretty about himself. Many of them sort of he bears his soul, and he does it in a way not to make us feel uncomfortable, but rather, I think, he's obviously making a point as an author, but he's giving us a great example. So I want to just start there, Nathan, and say thank you for your example of vulnerability in the book.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Now, having said that, a question I often start with, which is the journey. Like when you were 10 years old, you probably didn't say, hey, I'm going to write books about leadership. I'm going to coach leaders. I'm guessing, right? I'm guessing more like fireman, astronaut, something like that, doctor. And maybe mom had a different answer than you did. But my question really is like, what leads you to write this book specifically?
Yeah. I didn't play. It's really interesting. I didn't actually think of myself as a writer until I was probably 30 years old. I had very little writing experience, and actually, I was writing for free for a publication called the Bleacher Report while I was an investment banking analyst, and got a lot of reps doing sports writing. Which is maybe a separate topic.
That's a whole other story.
It is. It's a whole different story. Yeah, I wrote this book largely for my clients, and it starts with an experience that I had. So when I was at DoorDash, I was a couple years in, and I joined DoorDash at 250 employees. I was leading the HR team. The company was growing very rapidly, doubling headcount every single year. The valuation went from 600 million to 71 billion during my time there. And it was just a crazy, chaotic period. And I felt like for much of that time, I was just like trying to survive, holding on for dear life. And I had this experience a couple years in where I felt so stretched with work responsibilities, with family responsibilities. We had 3 kids at the time. We have 4 now. Church responsibilities, all of these different things. And it just all came to a head one Sunday morning. My work responsibilities had changed. The scope of my role was lessening. I'd gotten injured and sick. And I had this moment. My family was gone to church that day. And I just had this severe panic attack. And I found myself like on the ground in my bedroom crying uncontrollably. And I'd never experienced anything like that before. I haven't experienced anything like it since. It was my daughter's 2nd birthday, and I had to they're getting home from church and they're ready to do cake and ice cream. And I'm like, I can't handle myself right now. I need to get out. And I just disappeared. And I missed my daughter's birthday entirely. And what's interesting, Kevin, is this is around the same time I was planning on becoming a coach and looking to serve and help people. And I had this empty bucket. How do you fill someone else's bucket if yours is empty yourself? And that was a moment where I realized, like, okay, I need to do a lot of work. I may be showing up externally at work and with other people, but internally, I'm kind of a mess, and I need to work on some things. And so that experience, and then the experience working with a lot of clients who have gone through similar challenges, really what drove writing this book.
And the subtitle of the book, I don't think I said it earlier, is Mastering the Internal and External Game. And I would say by page count, it's 2/3 ish, maybe a little more than that, of internal versus external. And I hinted in the open that that's what we were going to focus on, because as I read it, I was thinking about what are the things that maybe might be most valuable to listeners, but also things that maybe we haven't talked about here as often over time. And I certainly realized, for those of you listening, that you haven't listened to all 438 other episodes, interviews. But my point being that, Nathan, I think there's some really interesting, useful stuff we can talk about here. And so I'm just sort of going to pick and choose some stuff, and we'll just have a little conversation about those things. At the beginning, you tell some more stories about the stories that you tell about yourself. And we all have stories that we tell about ourselves. And so let's just talk about what you mean by that. Give us an example, because we all have these things. Like we've decided, I call it what we define as our identity. Tell us about what you mean by that, and then let's talk briefly about how do we create a new story, consciously, intentionally create a new story for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So an example of this is Lehman Brothers. So I was a 2008 college graduate, joined Lehman Brothers, this like great investment bank. I'm so excited. I got this job on Wall Street, and I'm 2 months into the job. Lehman Brothers goes bankrupt, largest bankruptcy in U.S. history, and I'm there for a transition to a different bank, but ultimately a few months later, I get laid off. And as I go through this experience, and I'm out of work for what feels like an eternity. It's probably, I think it was about 4 months, but like when your career to date is a couple of months,
it's like forever, right?
Yes, it felt like forever. And so I had this experience where I'm unemployed. I'm struggling to find work, and these negative stories I start telling myself are like, oh, you probably got let go because you're not smart enough, because you're not good enough, because all of these things. And I end up getting a job at a much smaller company. It's at a retail bank, and I'm allocating baby clothes to different stores. And then these opportunities pop up to get back into investment banking. And I interview for a bunch of them, and all of them fall through. And it's like, same stories coming back. You're not smart enough, you're not good enough, all of this. And then a couple of weeks later, one of them reaches out and they say, the candidate we plan to hire, he didn't show up. So we're going to open up a final interview for you. And at that point, my wife and I, we didn't have any kids at the time, but we'd moved to a smaller apartment, and I'd kind of like embraced this mediocre life or mediocre mindset of like, okay, I'm just going to lower my expectations because I can't do this. And then I had this moment while I was walking to work. I'd already told them, no, I didn't plan to interview for this. And I decided, I had this strong impression, this strong feeling of like, you have to do this. Like, you can't just give up. You can't just like continue to tell this old story. So I ended up interviewing. I ended up getting the job. And that was key in me starting to tell myself a new story of like, okay, maybe I'm not excellent at this now, but I can be. And so I think I have learned through myself and working with other people that we have the power to tell ourselves a new story. And it starts first with recognition, like recognizing the story that you're telling yourself. And so I invite people to ask themselves two questions. The first is, what is a story you're telling yourself that no longer serves you? And this can be a lot of different things. This can be about your job, your potential, your physique, your health, whatever, your relationships, whatever it may be. What's a story you're telling yourself that no longer serves you? And then the second piece is, what is a story you would prefer to tell instead? And then once you recognize what that story may be, then okay, how do I create some evidence? How do I show myself that I have the power to tell this new story?
Yeah, I love that. And a few chapters later, I've been doing this, Nathan, a long time, not just this podcast, but this work, and the number of books in this general genre that I've read is sizable. We'll just leave it at that. And you talk about something in a chapter that I don't recall ever reading or ever hearing, certainly not in this level of specificity. And I think it's really fascinating, and it relates to the stories we tell ourselves, because you suggest that we can consider to create characters in our lives. So talk about this idea, because to me, there's a connection between the stories and this character creation. But tell us about how this would work, what it is, and how it would work for us as a leader wherever we sit in our organizations.
Yeah. So often we hear that we should show up as the same person in every situation. There should be consistency with how we show up. And while I think there's some truth to that, I have found what is required to be a successful CEO, or what's required to be a successful employee or entrepreneur, is very different than a successful husband or wife or significant other or a parent, or the various different roles. And so one of the lessons that I've learned in life is this power of character creation, of identifying the roles that we have and what it takes to be successful in each one of those roles.
It's that second part, Nathan. Like, all of us recognize roles. Like, and so if we stopped right there, people say, "What, are you crazy, Kevin?" Everyone talks about understanding roles, but you're taking it far further than that. You're saying, okay, if my role as author, well, let's pick that since both of us are one. Like, what does that really look like? And when am I in that role? And being very specific about that, and how that's then different from another role in my life. I love in the book where you talk about a person who said it's by time of day. This time of day, they're this person. So say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. A great example of that. I have a client who was a startup CEO. And he was very, very good at going heads down, like creating the vision of the company, articulating, or in his mind, like crafting the product roadmap, executing things. He was not very good at leading his team and communicating that. And he was also not very good at showing up with his significant other and with friends. And so he had put all of his energy into this very important role, but a singular role. And so together we created 3 different characters. The first was what we called the unicorn CEO. His name's Tyler. And this is who is the unicorn CEO? It's a people first, energetic leader who listens more than they talks. This leader this unicorn CEO sets aside time to be with people. And that's a role that he's going to play from 9 a.m. to 5 a.m. Like, that's it. Other people are in the office, that's the role. The second role was loving partner. Fun, loving, present for parents, significant other, friends. And that was a role from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m.
But notice, everybody, how specific Tyler made it, right? It wasn't just like, okay, I have this role, but like, here are the behaviors. That's the part that I think is so powerful about the way you describe it, Nathan, is those behaviors. Like, here's what that looks like to me when I'm in that role. Not just, hey, now I'm going to be at home and I'm going to try to be focused on my wife. Like, you're talking about something far more specific than that.
Yeah. And the reason why this specificity becomes really important is when you're working with world-class leaders, people who are excellent at what they do, they have a tendency to over-index on that area. They don't want to, but they over-index their time, their attention, at the expense of other things that are very important in their lives. And so when I'm working with a leader, usually it's not, hey, I'm no showing at work, but I have this awesome like life outside of it and all my relationships are great. It's usually like, oh, my work is so important and I'm building this business, but like I'm not the parent that I want to be, or the spouse I want to be, or my health, or whatever it may be. And so getting very specific into how you're going to show up, when you're going to show up. Some of them have even set like specific alarms of like, okay, it is 5 p.m. or it's 6 p.m., whatever it may be. Now you're going to switch into that mode. Anyway, and it's been really, really fun to see how they've showed up. It's being intentional.
Yeah, it really is ultimately about being intentional, and the idea of the alarm. I think in one case you talk about someone having music that goes with it. It is sort of a ritual that helps us make that shift, which is a really useful sort of thought as well. One of the chapters starts out with something that some who are listening to this might see as heresy, like, and I don't remember the title exactly. I don't want to take the time to look at it, but it's about deciding where to underperform. And people who are listening might say, what are you talking about? Like, I want to be really good at everything. I've got a lot that I need to be good at. I have high expectations of myself. That's probably why I'm listening to a podcast called the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Like, but you're saying decide where to underperform. What do you mean and why?
So yeah, there's this quote we often hear of like how we do something is how we do everything. And while it sounds good, I think that it is garbage, because like and this is one of the things I've learned is like there's limited energy in a given day, and the to-do list we have, I'm sure everyone's thinking this, like the to-do list just gets larger as each day goes along. We wake up, we get things done from it, but like we never fully accomplish
it's never zero. Like the to-do list is never zero.
Yeah. And so I found in order to focus on the things that are most important, it can be very valuable to pause on that and actually dive into those things that are not important, or the things that we're okay with letting slip. And so, an example of this with someone I worked with was like, okay, I'm going to intentionally underperform at networking. I'm not going to be at every conference. Like, because of what I'm focused on right now, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to intentionally underperform at cooking. We're just going to live off of takeout for a while. And being intentional about what we're not going to excel at, I think can become very freeing, because we don't have this like baggage over our shoulders that's telling us I should be doing this, I should be doing that, I'm not good enough at that. It's like, no, let's just call it out. Like, that's going to have to go on the back burner for now. And I'm okay with it. I'm very okay with it.
That relates to something else that I wasn't necessarily going to bring up, but it relates to something else that you talk about, which is the idea of not worrying about what other people think, right? Because one of the reasons we should on ourselves, right, is that we're saying, that person, they're cooking. Why am I not cooking?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm capable of cooking. I wonder what people are going to think of me when I do this, that, or the next thing. So talk about that a little bit more. Use a great example, a great sports example in the book, but this one is hard for lots of people, right? Like not worrying about what other people think.
Yeah. And this one is very easy to say and very hard to live. I am as guilty of this one as anybody. I mean, I chose early on in finance, I chose a career that was viewed from the outside as something that was attractive. It was hard to get a job in investment banking. And I found myself several years in of like, I don't like this. Like, why am I doing this? Why did I go down this path? And then I made this big career switch to human resources. And if investment banking is viewed as a sexy career path, human resources is kind of at the opposite end of the spectrum. And I was so worried and focused. I'm like, oh, what are my finance friends going to think about me if I make this jump? Like, what are people going to say? How do I answer their questions? And just in my mind, I'm telling myself the story, but I'm like, I feel like this is the right decision for me. It makes sense for me. I'm moving forward and going down this path.
And yet still, you've got this nagging, what are they going to think going on?
Yes. And then but as I told people I was making the switch, they were either very supportive or they didn't really care. Like, there's like one or two people who I think were like, oh, why are you doing that? And then I answered the question and they're like, oh, that sounds great. And for me, I love this quote that's attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt of, you wouldn't worry so much about what others think of you if you realized how seldom they do
about you. Yes, I remember what I think my daughter might not even remember it, but I felt like it was one of my better parental coaching moments when my daughter was in a spot. I'm like, how much time do you spend thinking about the others in class? She was not much. I said, that's how much time they're spending thinking about you. She was all worried about how things showed up in a presentation and this and that. And it's exactly right. And yet I raised my hand when you said that some of us have a hard time with that. I sometimes have a hard time with it too. I'm glad we brought that up when we talked about that a little bit. There's another thing that you talk about in the book, and it's in the external game section. But to me, it requires a whole lot of personal understanding to even be able to do it. So, and I've read and I've seen some of this before, but you did an excellent job of talking about what you call the personal operating system. We don't have time to go into a lot of depth about it, but I'd love for you to give people an idea about what you mean by it, because I think it's valuable. And I'll say this, I think it's especially valuable, if that's possible, maybe more valuable if you lead remotely, because people have less interaction with you. So with that setup, what do you mean by the personal operating system?
I'll start with, I completely agree, Kevin, that it is more important if you're working with people remotely. So this idea came from an executive who joined DoorDash. He was the head of engineering, and when he joined, the team was in a state of there's a lot going on, and he needed to very quickly build trust, execute on the roadmap. And he came in and had this personal operating manual that included his management style. It included the core values that he had, when and how to communicate, email versus Slack versus text, how he liked to set expectations of the team, and accountability. And he shared this with the team. And
that's the part I want to underline for everybody,
yeah.
right? Like a lot of what you just said, Nathan, people have heard and maybe even are doing some of it, but the extent to which, the specificity to which, and the fact that it's written down, not just talked about in some meetings, right? But like written down and shared as a manual, I think is what makes it perhaps more powerful.
Absolutely. And in the book, I share a couple of examples of that. I give recommendations and questions one can answer to complete an operating manual for themselves. But what I found the real value is twofold. The first is going through the process and answering, okay, what is my leadership style? What expectations do I have for my team? What do I want them to know about me so that we can build trust? And just going through and doing that work ourselves. And then the second is sharing it with other people so that they know. Because everyone wants to please their boss, get along well with them. And often we're kind of learning through trial and error. And I found that going through this process and creating it and sharing it with your team is just an excellent way to shortcut that process. And it's especially valuable for when you're new to an organization or when new people are joining an organization. And that's the piece with remote work, where you just see people in person less frequently, that it becomes really valuable.
I love that. Is that there's obviously lots of things, Nathan, that you and I could talk about, and I'm confident that's true. But is there any specific thing we haven't talked about? Maybe something that you feel led to talk about real quickly before we go into the final section of the show?
Yeah. So one of the chapters, and this is probably my favorite chapter in the book, and it's the story where I share this experience of running an Ironman. It's a 2.4 mile swim, 112 mile bike, 26.2 mile run, and the chapter title is called "Doing Hard Things," and I just love several of the concepts from the chapter, and they don't come from me. Is the need to deliberately seek out discomfort. And I have found this personally, and I've seen it in others, of unless we are regularly seeking out discomfort, the comforts we enjoy today very quickly become discomforts down the road. And I talk about this idea of doing a misogi, of doing one thing very, very challenging once a year that kind of resets the expectations. And in the book, I share the story of I had this flight that was delayed 30 minutes, and I wasn't going to be able to see my family that night. And I remember in that moment thinking this is the absolute worst thing that has ever happened to me. And I'm sitting in this air-conditioned airport.
It's a serious first world problem, Nathan.
Yes,
it's a serious first world problem.
Yes, and that it's kind of embarrassing to share this story. And I actually read this book. It's called The Comfort Crisis from Michael Easter, and some of the concepts in the chapter come from him. And I'm oh, something needs to change, because I'm like embarrassed that I'm now saying these words of like, okay, clearly I am not doing enough challenging things to reset expectations for what my life is. So anyway, that's one thing I'll share.
So Ironmans, we mentioned that before. You just mentioned it again. I like to ask people what they do for fun. I don't know if Ironmans count as fun, but what do you do for fun?
Yes, I play a fair amount of pickleball. I do really enjoy training for and competing in Ironmans. I I found that that's where I do my best thinking. Like, I'm away from the office, I'm outside. Um, I have a plan that I'm able to execute. I can see regular progress, and so it's I don't know if fun is the right word, but I found it to be very rewarding in a sense, and it helps me to do hard things, and resets expectations for what those hard things are. So I'm not in the airport complaining about my delayed flight.
There you go. So the thing you knew I was going to ask you is what you're reading. So what's something you've already mentioned, the Comfort Crisis, but what is something else that you're reading now or Nathan have read recently?
Yeah. A book that I just finished is called The Anxious Generation, and it's from Jonathan Haidt. I think that's how it's pronounced. Um, I have 4 kids. Their ages 5 through 13, and this book talks a lot about challenges that have been going on to the current generation, especially with the introduction of iPhones and social media and all of those things. And I found that book to be very helpful in thinking about my own habits with technology, as well as, with kids. How do we manage that? And so that's a book that I think has been a very insightful one. Not a leadership book, but certainly leadership applications that come from it.
So Nathan, where can we connect with you? Where do you want to point people? Where can they get a copy of the book, The Unconquerable Leader? Like, where do you want to point people?
Yeah, the book is available. I go to Amazon. It's paperback, Kindle, audiobook. If you want to say hi on LinkedIn, I'm very active on LinkedIn and would love to connect with you there. And then I have a landing page, nathantanner.net. And yeah, check out the book. I hope that you enjoy it. And yeah, please do say hi. I love meeting new people.
All right, awesome. So everybody, I have a question that I want to ask you that I ask every single episode. I think I've asked my last question of Nathan, but now I have one for you. And that question is, now what? What are you going to do as a result of the last 30 or so minutes? What idea, maybe there's a book that you want to read. I would certainly encourage you to get a copy of The Unconquerable Leader. But what else did you take from this? Maybe the idea of seeking out discomfort is worthwhile for you to consider. Maybe you heard something about intentionality, which to me is a big key throughout the course of our conversation. Maybe you heard some questions about the stories you tell yourself that you want to think a little bit more about. I don't know what it is that you take from this episode, but I do know that if you do more than just listen and consume, but actively apply something, this will be far more valuable to you than it would have been otherwise. So I leave you with that as always. Now what? The other thing, though, that you can do is, of course, make sure you come back. If you found this useful, I hope that you will subscribe wherever you're listening from. I hope that you will maybe suggest this to someone else to join us, maybe review it depending on where you are. You know how to do those things as a podcast consumer. I hope that you will do those things, and I hope you'll be back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.